Every time my driver took me to work, he brought his girlfriend along. Since it was on the way, I never said anything about it. Until one day, I opened the car door and found a note stuck to my seat in the back. Freeloaders not allowed in this car. I peeled the note off and turned to the driver. What is this? His girlfriend was sitting in the passenger seat, glaring at me with open contempt. Where are you listening to this story from, and what time is it? Please leave a comment below. The game had started. I held the yellow square of paper between my fingers. The ink was pressed hard into the surface, aggressive and completely unapologetic. Brooke did not turn around, but her dark eyes met mine directly through the rearview mirror. They were filled with a bizarre, unearned sense of superiority. She adjusted her designer sunglasses, items I instantly recognised from last season's luxury catalogue, and sighed loudly. She told me to read the room. She said if I could not afford my own transportation, I should take the city bus instead of leeching off her boyfriend's corporate perks. She called me a pathetic tag-along. Julian rushed around the vehicle to my open door. His face was entirely devoid of colour, pale and slick with nervous morning sweat. He stood deliberately between me and Brooke, effectively blocking her view, and lowered his voice to a desperate, trembling whisper. He begged me not to take it personally. He said Brooke had severe territorial insecurity and simply did not understand how corporate carpooling arrangements worked. He asked me, with wide, pleading eyes, to just ride quietly today. He promised he would drop her off first and then explain everything to her later, so this would never happen again. I looked at Julian. I noticed the slight, pathetic tremor in his hands. I noticed the way his gaze constantly darted back toward the passenger seat to ensure Brooke was not growing increasingly agitated. Julian was supposed to be my personal assistant and my temporary driver. His primary responsibility was to manage my complex daily schedule, not to manage his girlfriend's fragile ego at my direct expense. Yet, he stood there on the curb, actively asking me to accommodate a woman who had just called me a freeloader while sitting inside my own property. I did not raise my voice. I did not demand an immediate apology or throw a predictable, emotional tantrum. I simply folded the yellow note with precise, deliberate movements. I creased the edges until they were perfectly sharp, then slipped the piece of paper into the inner pocket of my tailored blazer. I gave Julian a single, brief nod. He exhaled a long, shaky breath that he had clearly been holding in terror. Relief washed over his pale face like a sudden wave. He closed my door softly and hurried back to the driver's seat. The cabin remained entirely silent, save for the faint, engineered hum of the luxury engine and the overpowering, synthetic scent of Brooke's perfume. I leaned back into the premium leather upholstery. I looked out the deeply tinted window as the busy city streets began to blur past us. The morning light reflected off the glass, casting long shadows across the interior. It was exactly 8:15 in the morning. I slowly reached down beside my right thigh. My fingers traced the smooth wood panelling of the door until I found the small, recessed button hidden underneath the armrest. I pressed it once. A tiny blue light blinked to life on the hidden console. It was a discrete system, completely separate from the standard vehicle controls. It synchronized directly with my private security servers. Every sigh, every insult, and every whispered lie was now being archived in high definition. Brooke turned up the radio, oblivious to the silent net closing around her. She hummed along to a pop song, entirely convinced of her own absolute dominance. I watched her reflection. The recording had begun. We arrived at the towering glass facade of the architectural firm's headquarters in downtown Chicago. The building itself was a testament to modern design, a structure I had personally sketched on a drafting table 9 years ago. Julian pulled the vehicle into the exclusive VIP drop-off zone. Brooke immediately pulled down the sun visor to check her heavy makeup. applying another thick layer of lip gloss. She loudly reminded Julian to pick her up precisely at 5 o'clock for their dinner reservation. She did not even acknowledge my presence as I quietly stepped out of the back seat. Julian scrambled out to open my door, but I was already standing on the pavement. He offered a weak, apologetic smile that did not reach his anxious eyes. I ignored it and walked smoothly through the revolving glass doors. The security guards at the entrance immediately stood up straighter, offering respectful nods as I passed. The receptionist quickly cleared the private elevator for my exclusive ascent. I was not a mid-level employee catching a free ride to save a few dollars on a taxi fare. I was Evelyn. I was the chairman and chief architect of this entire international firm. The vehicle Julian was currently driving was not a standard corporate fleet car. It was a custom-ordered luxury sedan, registered exclusively under my personal name. I had allowed Julian to use it temporarily to facilitate my chaotic travel schedule between construction sites and high-stakes client meetings. I had given him a profound privilege, and he had foolishly transformed it into a prop for his girlfriend's fabricated reality. I stepped into my expansive corner office on the top floor. The panoramic view of Lake Michigan stretched out endlessly beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. I sat behind my minimalist desk and opened my laptop. My mind was entirely clear. I did not feel the chaotic sting of immediate anger. Instead, I felt the cold, methodical clarity that always preceded my most critical business decisions. I opened the encrypted folder on my desktop that received the audio and video feeds from the car's hidden system. I listened to the playback. As soon as I had exited the vehicle, Brooke's voice filled the recording. She laughed sharply, telling Julian that the quiet mouse in the back gave her the creeps. She praised Julian for being such a powerful executive to have a company car at his disposal. Julian did not correct her. He simply agreed, soaking in her misguided admiration. He was building his entire romantic relationship on the fragile foundation of my assets. I opened my email to review the morning financial summaries. Among the routine multi-million-dollar project budgets, an automated alert from the corporate accounting department caught my attention. It was a notification regarding the company credit card issued specifically to my personal assistant. I clicked on the attachment. There was a recent transaction from a high-end boutique downtown. It was a purchase of nearly $3,000. It was for a limited edition designer handbag, the exact same brand Brooke frequently flaunted on her social media pages. Julian was actively financing his girlfriend's luxurious delusions with my company's capital. I downloaded the receipt. The numbers never lie. During my brief lunch break, I poured myself a cup of black coffee and casually checked the social media monitoring report my public relations team compiled daily. Usually, it contained industry mentions and architectural reviews. Today, the tracking algorithm had flagged a highly specific post. It was a short video uploaded by Brooke on her lifestyle page. She was sitting in the passenger seat of my car, panning the camera across the premium leather interior and the custom walnut dashboard. The caption read, "Morning commute in my boyfriend's chairman car, feeling extremely blessed." She had garnered thousands of likes and hundreds of comments praising her luxurious lifestyle. She was actively monetizing my property for her own digital validation. I took a slow sip of my coffee. The temperature was perfect. I took a high-resolution screenshot of the video, capturing the arrogant caption and the visible timestamp. I quietly added the image file to the growing encrypted folder on my desktop. That evening, I returned to my private penthouse. The moment the heavy oak door clicked shut, the sterile corporate world melted away. I placed my keys on the console table and walked into the spacious living room. A soft, rhythmic thumping sound echoed against the polished hardwood floor. It was Barnaby. He was a 12-year-old golden retriever I had adopted years ago. Due to a degenerative spinal condition, his hind legs were completely paralysed. He moved around using a custom-built, lightweight canine wheelchair. Barnaby rolled toward me, his golden tail wagging with pure, unadulterated joy. His eyes were cloudy with age, but they held more genuine warmth than any human I had interacted with all day. I knelt down, completely ignoring the wrinkles it might cause in my expensive trousers, and buried my face in his soft fur. He nudged his cold nose against my cheek. Barnaby was my sanctuary. He was the innocent, vulnerable heartbeat of my closely guarded private life. Barnaby was completely dependent on me. He required medication twice a day, specialised diet plans, and a strictly controlled environment to keep his chronic pain at bay. I provided all of it gladly, fiercely protecting his fragile existence. The contrast between his pure affection and Brooke's toxic entitlement was jarring. I carefully lifted Barnaby out of his mobility cart and carried him to his orthopaedic bed near the fireplace. I sat beside him, gently stroking his ears as he let out a contented sigh. For a brief moment, the world was perfectly still. Then, my personal cell phone buzzed loudly on the coffee table. The caller ID displayed the name of the Central City Hospital. A tight knot formed instantly in my chest. I answered the call. It was the chief attending physician from the cardiology wing. His voice was clinical, but carried an underlying tone of urgency. He informed me that Walter's condition had unexpectedly deteriorated over the past few hours. They needed to adjust his treatment protocol immediately, which required authorization for the next phase of intensive care coverage. The costs were going to be astronomical. I did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. I authorized the transfer of funds immediately. My quiet evening was over. I sat by the unlit fireplace for a long time, the silence of the penthouse pressing heavily around me. Many people in my corporate circle often wondered why a woman known for her ruthless efficiency would employ an assistant as visibly incompetent as Julian. They assumed it was an administrative oversight. They did not understand the profound, invisible chains of human gratitude. They did not know anything about Walter. Julian's grandfather, Walter, was not just a master carpenter. He was the man who had effectively saved my life. Decades ago, long before the skyscraper corner offices and the custom luxury vehicles. I was just a terrified teenager. My mother had passed away suddenly, leaving me drowning in a sea of aggressive medical debts and relentless creditors. I had absolutely nothing to my name but the cheap clothes on my back and a frayed sketchbook. We were completely destitute. Walter had been a quiet neighbour. He lived in a modest, dusty house down the street, spending his days crafting beautiful furniture from discarded wood. When the bank moved to foreclose on our tiny apartment, it was Walter who stepped in. He emptied his entire life savings to pay off the most immediate debts. He provided me with hot meals, a safe place to sleep, and the quiet encouragement to pursue my architectural dreams. He literally built the solid foundation upon which I constructed my entire empire. I owed that old man a heavy debt that corporate currency could never fully repay. A few years ago, Walter's health began to rapidly fail. His heart condition required constant, specialised care that his meagre pension could never cover. Around the exact same time, his grandson, Julian, had been fired from his third consecutive entry-level job. Walter had come to my office, leaning heavily on his wooden cane, his eyes downcast with profound shame. He asked me to give the boy one single chance to prove himself. I hired Julian the very next morning. I gave him a generous salary, comprehensive corporate benefits, and access to my personal resources. I did this not because Julian possessed any remarkable talent, but because his last name was the only tether I had left to the man who saved me. I tolerated Julian's consistent tardiness. I overlooked his minor administrative errors. I paid for Walter's expensive medical care directly, bypassing Julian entirely, to ensure the funds reached the hospital without interference. But gratitude, when left entirely unchecked, becomes a silent prison. It normalizes toxic behavior and demands endless concessions in the name of past loyalty. I had convinced myself that enduring Julian's growing arrogance and Brooke's petty daily insults was simply the necessary, unfortunate price of honouring Walter's legacy. I believed I was paying off a historical debt by absorbing their present-day disrespect. But looking at the encrypted folder on my laptop, containing the falsified credit card receipts and the arrogant social media posts, a cold realisation settled over me. My tolerance had not helped Julian grow. It had only taught him that there were absolutely no consequences for his actions. The shield was cracking. I stood up and walked steadily toward the heavy mahogany desk in my private study. I unlocked the bottom drawer with a quick biometric scan. Inside, resting perfectly on a bed of dark velvet, was a wooden sketching box. It was meticulously carved and beautifully inlaid with small, polished fragments of green jade. This was my mother's most treasured possession. She had traded years of grueling, physical labour, working double shifts until her hands physically bled, to acquire this single item. She hoped it would inspire me to design a better life for myself. Next to the jade sketching box lay a thick, leather-bound portfolio. It contained the foundational legal documents of my entire estate. Among them was the master deed to the heritage villa, located on the serene shores of Lake Michigan. It was a 120-year-old architectural marvel that I had spent several years carefully restoring to its original glory. It was my private sanctuary, a place where I retreated when the chaotic noise of the city became entirely unbearable. Before my mother passed, she made me promise to protect our future. She made me swear that no one would ever be able to strip away what we had fought so desperately to build. I kept that sacred promise by utilising the most impenetrable legal structures available. The Lake Michigan villa was not just registered in my name. It was securely locked inside an irrevocable trust. An irrevocable trust is a definitive legal fortress. Once an asset is placed safely inside it, the terms cannot be modified, amended, or terminated without the explicit, documented permission of the named beneficiary. In this case, the sole beneficiary was me. The trust document contained a highly specific, non-negotiable clause regarding the villa's occupancy. It explicitly stated that no individual could reside, rent, or occupy the property without my digitally verified biometric signature. Any unauthorised presence would immediately classify as a federal trespass and trigger an automated alert to my primary legal counsel. I ran my fingertips over the cool, smooth jade stones of the sketching box. I thought about Brooke's yellow sticky note. I thought about the $3,000 missing from the corporate account. Julian and Brooke believed they were cleverly manipulating a passive, ignorant employee. They believed they were playing a grand, sophisticated game of deception. They did not realise the game board they were dancing on was entirely rigged from the start. I had an army of contracts waiting quietly in the dark, ready to deploy the moment a threshold was crossed. The trust was not merely a piece of paper. It was a mechanism designed to utterly destroy any fraudulent claims of ownership or possession. I closed the drawer slowly, ensuring the velvet lay perfectly flat, and let the biometric lock engage with a solid, reassuring click. The green indicator light confirmed the mechanism was secure. The trap was set. I remember the exact afternoon Julian formally entered my life. It was a bitterly cold Tuesday in November. I was reviewing structural blueprints for a new commercial tower when my receptionist softly knocked on the frosted glass door. She informed me that an elderly gentleman was waiting in the lobby. He did not have an appointment, but he politely insisted that I would recognise his name. When I walked out to the reception area, I saw Walter. He was leaning heavily on a carved wooden cane, his posture bent by years of grueling physical labour and recent medical struggles. He looked incredibly fragile. Walter had not asked me for a single favour in over 2 decades. He had quietly watched me build my architectural empire from afar, never once reaching out to claim credit for the foundational support he had provided when I was a desperate, grieving teenager. But on that freezing afternoon, the profound shame etched across his weathered face told me everything. He was a proud man who had finally been broken by circumstance. He slowly explained that his grandson Julian had just been terminated from his third consecutive entry-level position. Walter was terrified for the boy's future. He asked if there was any possible menial task I could offer him. I hired Julian the very next morning. I did not require a formal interview or a background check. I assigned him the role of my personal assistant and temporary driver. The salary I offered was exceptionally generous, specifically designed to ensure he could comfortably support himself and assist his grandfather. During those first few months, Julian was the absolute picture of dedication. He arrived 15 minutes early every single day. He wore inexpensive, poorly tailored suits, but he kept them impeccably clean. He opened doors with eager enthusiasm and took meticulous notes during my meetings. However, proximity to immense wealth is a dangerous catalyst for weak characters. Julian spent his days navigating the highest echelons of corporate luxury. He drove my custom vehicles, interacted with billionaire developers, and arranged reservations at restaurants where a single dinner cost more than his previous monthly rent. He was merely observing my life, but he slowly began to internalize it as his own. The eager, humble young man slowly faded, replaced by someone who felt entitled to the luxury he was simply paid to facilitate. I noticed the subtle shifts in his demeanor. He started wearing designer ties that clearly exceeded his salary bracket. He began speaking to the building staff with a clipped, arrogant tone that he mistakenly believed mirrored executive authority. He started treating my custom sedan not as a corporate asset, but as his own personal chariot. He did not understand that I saw every single detail. He assumed my silence was a sign of complete ignorance. I watched him trade his grandfather's hard-earned integrity for a cheap, manufactured illusion of status. The corruption had truly begun. The first concrete piece of evidence did not come from a dramatic confrontation. It arrived quietly, attached to a routine quarterly expense report generated by my corporate accounting department. As the chairman, I rarely audited petty cash flow personally. However, I had established a strict internal protocol to flag any unusual spending patterns on the corporate cards issued to my direct support staff. On a quiet Wednesday morning, an automated notification appeared on my secure monitor. It highlighted a series of escalating anomalies on Julian's assigned account. I opened the digital ledger and adjusted my reading glasses. Julian was authorised to use the corporate card for necessary business logistics, client lunches, and minor office supplies. Instead, I saw a recurring pattern of highly questionable transactions. There were several charges at expensive steakhouses on weekends, neatly categorised as prospective client entertainment. There was a charge for a luxury spa retreat, vaguely labelled as a wellness incentive. Most glaringly, there was a transaction for nearly $3,000 at a high-end designer boutique located just 2 blocks from my penthouse. I sat back in my ergonomic chair and placed my hands flat on the desk. I did not pick up the phone to scream at my assistant. I did not summon human resources to immediately draft a termination notice. Instead, I opened a highly secure, encrypted shadow ledger on my private server. I began downloading every single fraudulent receipt, carefully organising them by date and vendor. I cross-referenced the dates of his expensive dinners with his approved time-off requests. The discrepancies were glaring and entirely undeniable. Any other executive would have fired him on the spot, but every time I considered confronting Julian, the image of Walter's fragile, hopeful face flashed in my mind. Just 2 days prior, I had authorised a direct wire transfer to the cardiology unit to cover Walter's latest round of specialised treatments. If I fired Julian for corporate theft, I would be forced to press charges to satisfy the company's strict insurance policies. A criminal record would completely destroy the young man's future, and the resulting stress would undoubtedly kill his grandfather. So, I made a calculated, difficult choice. I silently categorised the stolen funds as a personal loss, absorbing the financial hit entirely out of my own private accounts to keep the corporate auditors satisfied. I continued to pay Walter's medical bills directly to the hospital, ensuring Julian could never access those critical funds. I chose to endure the theft to protect the innocent man who had once protected me. But Julian did not view my lack of reaction as an act of profound grace. He viewed it as a glowing endorsement of his own cleverness. He mistook patience for blindness. The atmosphere inside the vehicle fundamentally shifted the day Brooke decided she belonged there. It was a rainy Tuesday morning when Julian pulled up to the curb. As usual, I stepped out of my building, holding a sleek leather briefcase containing the final drafts for a new museum project. When I opened the heavy back door of the sedan, a thick, suffocating cloud of synthetic floral perfume hit my face. Brooke was sitting in the passenger seat. She did not turn around to greet me. She was busy staring into the illuminated sun visor mirror, aggressively applying a thick layer of lip gloss. She was chewing a piece of gum with an exaggerated, rhythmic popping sound that echoed loudly in the confined luxury cabin. Julian stood outside in the rain, holding an umbrella over my head, looking incredibly nervous. He stammered a quick, disjointed explanation about Brooke's office being on our direct route and how the terrible weather made it impossible for her to secure a taxi. I simply nodded, folded my wet umbrella, and slid into the back seat. For the first 10 minutes, the ride was silent, save for the rhythmic slapping of the windshield wipers and the obnoxious popping of Brooke's gum. Then, she let out a loud, theatrical sigh. She turned her head slightly, offering me a sharp, dissecting glare over her shoulder. Her eyes swept over my outfit. I was wearing a bespoke, unbranded charcoal wool coat and simple black trousers. It was an ensemble worth several $1,000s, crafted entirely for comfort and quiet elegance. To Brooke's logo-obsessed eyes, however, the lack of visible branding clearly signified poverty. "Babe," Brooke whined loudly, directing her voice at Julian but ensuring I heard every single syllable. "Why does the back seat always smell so musty? It smells like a thrift store back there." "Are you sure you shouldn't ask the corporate fleet manager to assign you a better vehicle? It is honestly embarrassing that an executive of your level has to share space with basic admin staff." Julian gripped the leather steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned completely white. He forced a strained laugh and muttered something unintelligible about the rainy weather causing strange odours. Brooke was not satisfied. She reached into her oversized, heavily branded handbag, pulled out a small bottle of cheap aerosol disinfectant, and blindly sprayed it backward over her shoulder. A cold mist settled over my architectural blueprints. I did not flinch. I did not offer a single word of protest. I simply watched her perform her ridiculous pantomime of superiority. The delusion was completely absolute. Brooke's initial passive-aggressive comments inside the vehicle quickly evolved into brazen, physical overreach. She was no longer satisfied with merely claiming the passenger seat during the morning commute. She actively sought to assert her fabricated dominance within the public sphere of my corporate headquarters. One Thursday afternoon, she arrived at the towering glass lobby of my firm, ostensibly to bring Julian a decorative cup of iced coffee. I was walking across the expansive marble floor, returning from a highly confidential meeting with the city's zoning commissioners. I was surrounded by my senior legal counsel and 2 lead project managers. The lobby was bustling with high-level executives and international clients. As I approached the main revolving doors, Brooke spotted me from the reception desk. A cruel, vindictive spark illuminated her eyes. She deliberately altered her trajectory, marching directly into my path with her chin raised high. She timed her movement perfectly. As I stepped forward to exit, Brooke aggressively slammed her shoulder into mine. The impact was entirely intentional. A small splash of her iced coffee spilled onto the sleeve of my blazer. My security detail immediately stepped forward, their hands instinctively reaching out to intervene. I raised a single finger, instantly freezing them in place. The entire lobby seemed to hold its collective breath. Brooke sneered at me, her voice carrying loudly across the marble expanse. "Watch exactly where you are walking. You need to learn some basic respect for your superiors. You might just be a low-level paper pusher stealing rides from my boyfriend, but that does not mean you own this building." My senior legal counsel, a brilliant and notoriously ruthless woman named Diane, opened her mouth to verbally decimate the girl. I gently touched Diane's arm, signalling her to stand down. I looked directly at Brooke. Her face was flushed with the thrilling rush of unearned power. She firmly believed she had just humiliated a helpless subordinate in front of an entire corporate audience. I did not raise my voice. I did not demand an apology. I simply brushed the drop of coffee off my sleeve, adjusted my briefcase, and walked past her without uttering a single word. I proceeded directly to the central security control room, located on the mezzanine level. The head of corporate security stood at strict attention as I entered. I instructed him to pull the high-definition footage from the main lobby cameras covering the past 10 minutes. I watched the sharp, undeniable digital recording of Brooke intentionally altering her path to physically assault me. I requested a secure digital copy. I added it to the encrypted folder on my private server, right next to Julian's fraudulent credit card receipts. I labelled this specific file the final indulgence. The file was securely saved. Later that evening, the chaotic noise of Brooke's pathetic public display completely vanished the moment I stepped inside my private penthouse. The air here was perfectly filtered, the lighting meticulously calibrated to enhance focus and tranquility. I poured a glass of mineral water and walked toward the expansive floor-to-ceiling windows. The glittering skyline of Chicago stretched out beneath me, an endless grid of steel and light. Many of those illuminated towers were structures my firm had successfully engineered. I sat down at my heavy mahogany desk and opened an elegant, leather-bound portfolio. Inside lay a massive international commercial development contract. The terms had been fiercely negotiated over the past 6 months, involving complex zoning laws, environmental impact studies, and a budget exceeding $75 million. I picked up my heavy Mont Blanc fountain pen. I reviewed the final clauses with a practiced, analytical eye, verifying that every single legal safeguard was firmly in place. With a smooth, decisive motion, I signed my name at the bottom of the document. This was the nature of actual power. It did not require cheap theatrics in a crowded lobby. It did not demand validation from strangers on a digital platform. Real power was signing a document in complete silence that fundamentally altered the skyline of a major metropolis. It was the ability to deploy immense capital and legal force with a single stroke of ink. As the ink dried on the $75 million agreement, my secondary monitor chimed softly. It was an automated update from the social media tracking software. Brooke had just uploaded a new video. She was standing outside her modest apartment, leaning provocatively against the hood of my custom luxury sedan. The caption loudly declared that her amazing executive boyfriend was taking her away for a romantic, VIP weekend. She was actively performing wealth while standing completely bankrupt in reality. I closed the video and opened my private banking portal. I navigated to the specific account dedicated to Walter's ongoing medical expenses. I reviewed the hospital's latest billing statement, confirming that his upcoming surgical procedure was fully funded and completely insulated from Julian's reach. My obligations to the past were secure. The debt of gratitude had been managed, compartmentalized, and legally protected. I leaned back and looked at the sleeping form of Barnaby in his orthopaedic bed. The time for passive observation was rapidly approaching its definitive end. Julian and Brooke were carelessly accelerating toward a legal and financial brick wall, completely blinded by their own unchecked arrogance. I did not need to scream or fight to reclaim my territory. I only needed to let them confidently unlock the door to their own total destruction. Real power is always quiet. It was precisely 9 o'clock on a Friday evening. I was sitting in the quiet solitude of my penthouse, reviewing the final structural schematics for a municipal library project. The vibrant city lights of Chicago glowed softly through the expansive floor-to-ceiling glass windows. Out of sheer meticulous habit, I opened the automated social media monitoring report compiled by my public relations team. Normally, I only scan the document for relevant corporate mentions or industry news. Today, however, a highly specific digital alert caught my immediate attention. Brooke had posted a new, heavily filtered photo album to her public lifestyle page. The geographic location tag instantly made my blood run entirely cold. The location was explicitly tagged at a specific shoreline on Lake Michigan. The vivid photographs showed Brooke posing aggressively on a sprawling, perfectly manicured lawn. Behind her stood a stunning, historic stone facade that I recognised down to the last architectural detail. The caption accompanying the photos was a masterclass in absolute unchecked delusion. It proudly announced to her, thousands of followers, that she was spending a luxurious, deeply romantic weekend at her executive boyfriend's private heritage villa. She openly bragged about the exclusive lakefront access, the imported masonry, and the antique architecture. She was no longer just claiming my company car. She was actively claiming the 120-year-old estate that I legally owned. That villa was not merely a piece of high-value residential real estate. It was a profound, deeply personal symbol of my ultimate survival. I had spent countless millions and several years meticulously restoring its original oak beams and European masonry. It was a fiercely guarded sanctuary where I kept my most valuable, irreplaceable family possessions. No one in the corporate office, absolutely no one, had unauthorised access to that specific property. Julian only knew the exact address and gate codes because he handled the routine payment logistics for the elite landscaping and security maintenance crews. He had actually taken her there. He had undoubtedly used his trusted administrative access to bypass the standard security protocols, likely lying to the perimeter guards by claiming he was there on official business for me. He had brought a loud, deeply disrespectful woman into the absolute centre of my private, protected world. I clicked through the comments. Her followers were leaving hundreds of messages praising her incredible lifestyle and her incredibly successful boyfriend. I stared at the glowing screen, silently analysing the sheer, breathtaking audacity of the invasion. They were essentially throwing a reckless, unsupervised party inside my personal vault. I did not throw my phone across the room. I did not shatter a glass in a predictable fit of melodramatic rage. I simply closed the laptop with a soft, definitive click. My mind instantly shifted from passive observation into a state of pure, calculating absolute zero. The time for quietly honouring Walter's past debts had officially, permanently expired. Julian had crossed an unpardonable line. I picked up my phone and set an early alarm for the next morning. I needed to verify this betrayal personally. The weekend had officially begun. The following morning, a dense layer of grey clouds hung heavily over the city. I woke up at exactly 6 o'clock, completely rested and entirely devoid of hesitation. My schedule was typically clear on Saturdays, reserved exclusively for quiet reading and tending to my disabled golden retriever. Barnaby. Barnaby spent most of his time at the Lake Michigan villa, where I had installed custom, gentle ramps and heated flooring specifically for his severe spinal condition. I had a dedicated weekend caretaker named Martha who looked after him when I was stuck in the city. I picked up my phone and dialed Martha's private number. It went straight to voicemail. A slight, dangerous frown creased my forehead. I then dialed Julian's corporate cell phone. It rang exactly 5 times before he finally answered. His voice was thick with sleep, heavily laced with the unmistakable grogginess of a late-night party. In the background, I could hear the faint, muffled sound of a television playing. "Julian," I said, keeping my tone perfectly measured and pleasantly neutral. "I need you to bring the sedan around. I have decided to head out to the lake house this morning to check on Barnaby and retrieve some archived blueprints from the library." There was a sudden, sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. I could practically hear the gears grinding in his panicked mind as he scrambled to construct a viable excuse. He stammered, clearing his throat awkwardly. "Miss Evelyn," he began, his voice pitching slightly higher with obvious manufactured distress. "I am so incredibly sorry. I woke up this morning and discovered the sedan had a completely flat tyre. I am actually sitting at a suburban auto repair shop right now. The mechanic just told me they have to order a specific custom part. The vehicle will not be ready until late Monday morning. I can call a premium car service for you immediately if you would like." It was a pathetic, flimsy lie. He was currently lying in my guest bed, under my expensive linen sheets, inside my house, boldly telling me that my car was broken down in a non-existent repair shop. He was actively trying to prevent me from visiting my own property because his girlfriend was currently occupying it. "I see," I replied smoothly. I did not let a single ounce of suspicion bleed into my voice. "That is quite unfortunate. Julian, please do not worry about the car service. I will simply make alternative arrangements. Focus on getting the vehicle properly repaired." "Thank you so much for understanding. Miss Evelyn," he exhaled, the immense relief practically dripping through the cellular connection. "I will handle everything." I ended the call. I placed the phone gently on the marble kitchen counter. Julian truly believed he had flawlessly managed the situation. He believed his pathetic deception had bought him another 48 hours of stolen luxury. He had no idea that he had just handed me the final, necessary piece of evidence. I walked to the hallway closet and retrieved my heavy cashmere coat. A cold smile touched my lips. Within 15 minutes, I had secured a private, unmarked black car service. I instructed the professional driver to take the most direct route out of the city, heading straight toward the serene forested shores of Lake Michigan. The drive took just over an hour. The rhythmic hum of the tyres against the wet asphalt provided a perfect backdrop for my absolute clarity. I watched the dense urban landscape slowly transition into towering pine trees and expensive and secluded private gates. My property was situated at the very end of a winding, private road, shielded from public view by ancient, massive oak trees. As the black car approached the heavy wrought iron security gates, I rolled down the window and entered my master override code into the hidden keypad. The heavy metal doors swung open in complete eerie silence. I instructed the driver to proceed slowly down the long, crushed gravel driveway. The estate finally came into view. The historic stone masonry stood proudly against the grey morning sky, an architectural masterpiece that I had poured my soul into preserving. But the pristine elegance of the property was immediately shattered by the sight waiting near the main entrance. Parked carelessly, angled awkwardly across the meticulously raked gravel, was my custom black corporate sedan. The very same vehicle Julian had just sworn was sitting helpless in a suburban repair shop with a flat tyre. The tyres, of course, were perfectly fully inflated. The sheer disrespect was staggering, even from 50 yards away. I could hear the heavy, thumping bass of electronic dance music reverberating through the thick, century-old walls of my home. The front door, A massive slab of carved mahogany was propped wide open, letting the cold autumn air rush directly into the climate-controlled foyer. Empty glass bottles and brightly coloured plastic cups littered the pristine stone steps leading up to the entrance. The driver stopped the vehicle a short distance from the house. He glanced at me through the rearview mirror, his professional demeanour masking a hint of genuine concern. He asked me politely if I needed him to call the local authorities or wait for me. I politely declined both offers. I handed him a generous cash tip, thanked him for his swift service, and stepped out into the crisp, damp air. The cold wind whipped my hair around my face as I stood alone on the gravel. I looked at my beautiful, defiled sanctuary. They had not merely trespassed. They had treated my sacred space like a cheap, disposable rental property. I adjusted the collar of my cashmere coat, ensuring my posture was perfectly straight. I did not run. I did not scream for security. I moved with the deliberate, unhurried pace of an apex predator, stepping confidently into its own territory. I walked toward the front door. I stepped through the open mahogany doorway and crossed the threshold into my own home. The immediate sensory assault was profoundly nauseating. The refined, familiar scent of antique wood, old paper, and expensive lemon oil had been completely replaced by the overwhelming stench of cheap stale beer, artificial fruit vapour, and lingering cigarette smoke. I stood perfectly still in the grand foyer, letting my eyes meticulously document every single detail of the destruction. The expansive living room, usually a testament to minimalist elegance, looked like the aftermath of a chaotic fraternity party. The irreplaceable, hand-woven Persian rug covering the centre floor was heavily stained with dark, muddy footprints and sticky, spilled alcohol. Empty food containers, sunflower seed shells, and discarded pizza boxes were piled high on the priceless, custom-built walnut coffee table. Several unfamiliar people were sprawled lazily across my expensive velvet sofas, deeply asleep or mindlessly scrolling through their phones. The heavy, rhythmic bass of the electronic music vibrated through the floorboards, an insulting soundtrack to the desecration of my family's legacy. Brooke was standing near the grand stone fireplace, wearing one of my imported silk robes over her clothes. She was loudly recording another video on her phone, gesturing wildly toward the vaulted ceiling, boasting to her digital audience about her incredible weekend life. She was utterly oblivious to my silent arrival. My gaze swept past her and landed on the floor near the hearth. My breath hitched, freezing completely in my chest. There, lying carelessly among discarded beer caps and dirty napkins, were the shattered remains of my mother's wooden sketching box. The exquisite, polished fragments of green jade had been violently knocked off the mantel. The delicate hinges were entirely snapped, and the beautiful stones my mother had bled for were scattered across the floor like broken teeth. Someone had clearly bumped into the display stand during their drunken revelry and simply left the priceless artifact completely destroyed on the ground. A sharp, physical ache pierced my ribs. That box was the only tangible piece of my mother's grueling sacrifice that I had left in this world. It was a sacred relic of my survival, and these careless, entitled parasites had smashed it without a second thought. The sheer, overwhelming magnitude of their disrespect transcended mere financial theft. It was an unforgivable assault on my deeply personal history. I did not gasp. I did not drop to my knees to gather the broken pieces of jade. I remained firmly rooted to the hardwood floor. The calculating, professional architect inside me immediately took complete control, meticulously categorizing the emotional devastation as future legal evidence. I stared at the shattered green fragments shining dimly against the dirty wood. They had crossed the absolute final line. The heritage was completely destroyed. One of Brooke's friends, a young woman lounging on the velvet sofa, finally looked up and noticed me standing in the foyer. She nudged Brooke aggressively, pointing a shaking finger in my direction. Brooke lowered her phone. Her false, bright smile instantly twisting into a mask of ugly, unfiltered contempt. She tightened the belt of my silk robe and marched across the ruined Persian rug toward me. Her heels clicked sharply against the floor. "What the hell are you doing here?" Brooke shrieked, her voice echoing harshly off the vaulted ceilings. "Did you actually follow my boyfriend all the way out here? You pathetic stalker, I told Julian he needed to get a restraining order against you. You are completely psychotic. Get out of my house right now before I call the cops." She raised her hand, fully intending to aggressively shove my shoulder exactly as she had done in the corporate lobby. But before she could make physical contact, a sound completely shattered my focus. It was a faint, desperate, and incredibly weak whimper. It was coming from the back of the property, specifically from the direction of the unheated, detached gardening shed. My blood froze instantly. Martha, the dedicated caretaker I paid handsomely to watch over him, was obviously nowhere to be found. Julian had undoubtedly dismissed her to clear the house for his pathetic gathering. I bypassed Brooke entirely, violently shoving her extended arm away with a force that sent her stumbling backward into the wall. I practically tore through the kitchen and burst out the back door, sprinting across the damp, freezing grass toward the heavy wooden doors of the storage shed. I ripped the heavy iron latch open. The interior was pitch black and brutally cold. In the far corner, shivering violently on the freezing concrete floor, lay Barnaby. He was completely separated from his custom mobility wheelchair, rendering him entirely helpless and immobile. His water bowl was completely empty. He let out a tragic, exhausted whine when he saw the light, struggling weakly to lift his grey head. I dropped to my knees, wrapping my expensive cashmere coat entirely around his freezing, trembling body. I buried my face in his neck, feeling his rapid, terrified heartbeat. Brooke had followed me out into the yard, crossing her arms defensively against the cold wind. She looked down at us with a sneer of absolute disgust. "Oh, please!" Brooke scoffed loudly. "I locked that useless mangy dog in there last night because he kept dragging his dirty wheels across my clean carpets. It is just an animal. Stop being so incredibly dramatic." "Nuban chung kong titha tu cho ke lam hai, mo chu cho tantat, hai bin luan, bao ve Barnaby." She had tortured an innocent, disabled animal simply to preserve her own arrogant aesthetic. The cold clarity that had guided me all morning instantly crystallized into something infinitely more dangerous. I gathered Barnaby's shivering weight into my arms, holding him tightly against my chest. I looked up at Brooke. I did not scream. I did not curse. I did not shed a tear. I did not engage with Brooke. Her hysterical, high-pitched accusations were nothing more than meaningless, irritating noise. I kept my heavy cashmere coat wrapped securely around Barnaby's freezing, trembling body. I carried him carefully across the wet, overgrown grass, completely ignoring the mud staining my expensive designer shoes. I walked straight to my rented transport vehicle, directing the driver to turn the rear heating system to its absolute maximum capacity. I placed Barnaby gently on the heated seats, ensuring he was comfortable and safe. Then, I turned around and walked back into the desecrated living room. Brooke had her arms crossed defensively over her chest, tapping her foot impatiently. She was clearly bracing herself for a dramatic, screaming confrontation. She wanted a melodramatic fight to validate her aggressive behaviour. I refused to give her that satisfaction. I completely ignored her existence. I knelt gracefully onto the ruined, sticky Persian rug and methodically began gathering the shattered pieces of green jade. The sharp edges of the broken stones cut into my fingertips, drawing tiny beads of blood. But I felt absolutely no physical pain. The cold, calculating architect inside my mind had already taken total control of my nervous system. Brooke let out a harsh, mocking laugh. She called me a pathetic freak for crawling on the floor over a broken, ugly wooden box. She loudly proclaimed that Julian would buy her a brand new, modern house anyway. What Brooke completely failed to comprehend was the profound, inescapable legal reality of the physical structure she was currently standing inside. This historic villa was not a casual, liquid asset. It was a fortress tightly secured within a highly specific, irrevocable trust. An irrevocable trust is not merely a piece of paper, it is an impenetrable financial entity. Once an asset is transferred into it, the original owner surrenders absolute control to the trust itself. The mandates I had established were explicitly clear. The property was strictly prohibited from being rented, leased, or occupied by any third party without my verified biometric authorization. Any verbal agreement Julian might have falsely offered her was completely null and void. By physically occupying this specific residence, Brooke and her friends were not merely throwing a loud, disrespectful party. They were actively committing severe, documented federal trespassing and massive property destruction against a protected legal entity. I picked up the final jagged piece of green jade and placed it securely in my pocket. I stood up smoothly, adjusting my coat. I looked around the room one last time, mentally cataloguing every single cigarette burn, every broken glass, and every muddy footprint. I did not need to scream at these trespassers. Their own ignorance had already completely sealed their fate. I turned my back on Brooke's sneering face and walked out the front doors into the freezing wind. I climbed into the transport vehicle, holding Barnaby close. The game was completely over. Monday morning arrived with crisp, incredibly cold efficiency. The weekend rain had cleared, leaving the Chicago skyline sharp and brilliantly illuminated. I walked into the austere, hyper-modern conference room of my primary corporate law firm. Diane, my remarkably ruthless senior legal counsel, was already waiting. She sat at the head of the polished mahogany table, her posture perfectly straight, a steaming cup of black coffee resting untouched beside her notebook. I did not offer any pleasantries. I placed a thick, encrypted digital hard drive directly onto the centre of the table. The drive contained every single piece of documented evidence. It held the high-definition lobby camera footage showing Brooke intentionally initiating physical contact. It contained the extensive audio recordings from the custom corporate sedan, detailing every single insult and every fabricated claim of ownership. It included the meticulously organised digital receipts of Julian's unauthorised credit card transactions. Most importantly, it contained the newly retrieved security footage from the hidden cameras inside the Lake Michigan villa. The lenses had captured everything perfectly. The unauthorised entry, the extensive property damage, Brooke violently smashing the jade box, and the horrifying moment she callously locked Barnaby in the freezing shed. Diane connected the drive to the secure conference monitor. We sat in total silence as the brutal footage played out on the large screen. Diane's expression did not change, but her eyes narrowed into sharp, dangerous slits as she processed the sheer, breathtaking scale of the legal violations. She began listing the charges in a quiet, methodical voice. There was felony trespassing. There was grand larceny regarding the corporate funds. There was intentional destruction of priceless heritage property. And finally, there was severe, documented animal cruelty. Diane looked at me over the rim of her designer glasses. She asked if I wanted to offer Julian a quiet, discreet opportunity to resign to avoid a public corporate scandal. She reminded me of my long-standing loyalty to his grandfather, Walter. I looked out the massive window at the sprawling city below. I thought about the terrified, helpless look in Barnaby's cloudy eyes when I opened that shed door. I thought about my mother's broken jade. I turned back to Diane and shook my head once. I instructed her to prepare the maximum possible legal response. Ban so jong I rang su trung fat jang son hat kong fai lanam jam, malag yai to fa pli kong. We spent the next 4 hours meticulously assembling the board. We drafted the civil lawsuits for the property damage. We prepared the formal criminal complaints to be filed directly with the district attorney. We finalised Julian's immediate, irrevocable termination papers. I was not going to merely fire an incompetent assistant. I was going to systematically dismantle their entire fabricated reality, using the full, crushing weight of the judicial system. I signed my name perfectly on 12 separate legal documents. The machine was fully awake. It was early Tuesday morning when the trap finally snapped shut. I returned to the Lake Michigan villa, but this time I was absolutely not alone. The quiet serenity of the private forested road was broken by the arrival of a convoy. I was flanked by 6 heavily armed, highly trained corporate security personnel, all dressed in identical, impeccably tailored black suits. Diane walked calmly by my right side, carrying her thick, black leather briefcase. We bypassed the gate keypad entirely, overriding the system to allow the heavy vehicles onto the property. We approached the front entrance of the historic estate. The front door was still completely unlocked, a testament to their staggering arrogance. My security team moved with silent, brutal efficiency. They fanned out across the perimeter, securing every possible exit point before stepping smoothly into the grand foyer. The living room was still a catastrophic, foul-smelling mess. Brooke and her entourage were slowly waking up, groggy, hungover, and completely disoriented by the sudden, terrifying intrusion of stern men in dark suits. Brooke sat up on the ruined velvet sofa, pulling a blanket to her chin. Her eyes widened in absolute shock as she recognized me standing calmly in the center of the room. She immediately began screaming, her voice shrill and completely unhinged. She demanded to know who these men were. She aggressively threatened to call Julian, swearing he would have us all arrested for breaking into his private home. She pointed a visibly shaking finger directly at my face, fully prepared to launch into another tirade about my supposed poverty. Before she could form another insult, the front door creaked open behind us. Julian walked in, humming a cheerful tune. He was carrying 3 large brown paper bags filled with expensive artisanal breakfast pastries and premium coffee. He stopped completely dead in his tracks. The cheerful humming died instantly in his throat. He saw the 6 security guards holding their positions. He saw Diane standing with her formidable briefcase. And finally, his terrified eyes locked onto mine. The blood completely drained from Julian's face, leaving his skin the colour of dirty chalk. His hands began to tremble so violently that he lost his grip entirely. The heavy paper bags slipped from his fingers, crashing onto the hardwood floor. The expensive coffee cups burst open upon impact, sending a dark, steaming puddle rapidly spreading across the pristine wood, mingling with the stale beer and cigarette ash. Julian did not attempt to clean it up. He simply stared at me, his breathing shallow and rapid. He realised instantly that his prolonged game of deception had reached its catastrophic, unavoidable conclusion. The illusion was totally shattered. The absolute silence in the ruined living room was deafening. Brooke continued to shriek at Julian, demanding that he assert his authority and throw us out immediately. Julian did not look at her. His legs simply gave out. He collapsed onto his knees right in the middle of the spilled coffee, completely ignoring the dark liquid soaking into his expensive designer trousers. He clasped his trembling hands together and looked up at me, tears streaming rapidly down his pale face. He begged me for mercy. He did not apologize for the theft, nor did he apologize for the destruction. He immediately invoked his grandfather's name. Julian desperately pleaded that a formal criminal record would utterly destroy his life, and the resulting public scandal would certainly cause Walter's fragile heart to finally fail. He weaponized the very man who had saved me, attempting to use my own profound gratitude as a pathetic shield against his consequences. I stood perfectly still, my posture completely rigid. I looked down at him with eyes as cold and unforgiving as the frozen lake outside the windows. I thought about the invisible victims of his unchecked arrogance. I thought about my mother, working until her fingers bled to build a future I was currently standing in, only to have her legacy carelessly smashed by a girl pretending to be wealthy. I thought about Barnaby, a loyal, defenseless animal, shivering alone in the dark because his mere existence inconvenienced their fragile aesthetic. For months, people like Julian and Brooke had fundamentally misunderstood me. They assumed that my quiet patience, my refusal to engage in petty arguments, was a definitive sign of weakness. They genuinely believed that the invisible workers, the silent victims, and the quietly grateful could simply be pushed aside and endlessly exploited. They mistook my profound grace for profound stupidity. I looked Julian directly in his weeping eyes. I spoke in a voice so incredibly quiet and steady that everyone in the room had to lean forward to hear it. I told him that my immense historical gratitude to his family was the only reason he had survived his own incompetence for so long. I told him I had paid his grandfather's medical bills directly to bypass his sticky, thieving fingers. I told him that the protective umbrella of Walter's legacy had permanently closed the exact second Brooke turned the lock on that freezing shed. You do not get to use Walter's honour to pay for your crimes, I stated softly. Your grandfather built a foundation of integrity. You chose to build a house of cheap, pathetic lies, and now you will quietly watch it burn to the ground. Julian sobbed uncontrollably, bowing his head toward the ruined floorboards. There was no mercy left. Brooke was violently hyperventilating on the sofa. The sight of her supposedly powerful executive boyfriend weeping on the floor like a reprimanded child broke the final fragile threads of her comprehension. She grabbed Julian's shoulder, her manicured nails digging deeply into his tailored jacket. She hysterically demanded to know why he was kneeling to a pathetic administrative assistant. She ordered him to stand up, call the police, and aggressively assert his ownership of the estate. I offered a single, subtle nod to Diane. My senior counsel stepped forward with the precise, practiced authority of a seasoned litigator. The sharp, metallic click of her leather briefcase opening echoed like a gunshot in the tense room. Diane smoothly extracted a thick stack of watermarked, legally bound documents. She did not raise her voice. She projected it with devastating clarity. Diane began reading the official property deed and the irrevocable trust mandate aloud. She clearly articulated my full legal name, my official title as chairman of the board, and my definitive sole ownership of the entire Lake Michigan estate. She then pulled out the corporate registration for the custom luxury sedan, reading the VIN number and confirming my exclusive ownership. Brooke stared wildly at the documents, her mind violently rejecting the impossible information. The reality was simply too massive for her fragile ego to absorb. Brooke turned her frantic gaze back to Julian. She shook his shoulders violently, screaming at him to tell everyone that these women were crazy liars. She demanded he produce the mortgage papers. Julian could not lift his eyes from the floor. He kept his gaze firmly glued to the muddy footprints on the ruined rug. His voice, when it finally emerged, was nothing more than a hollow, broken, and utterly defeated whisper. It is her house, Brooke. Julian choked out, the words tearing through his throat. The villa is hers. The custom car is hers. The entire corporate firm is hers. He swallowed hard, a visible shudder wrecking his frame. I am just her driver. That is all I am. I am her driver. The transformation on Brooke's face was absolutely fascinating to witness. The bright, arrogant flush of unearned superiority completely vanished, replaced by a sickly, terrifying shade of pale grey. Her jaw dropped open, but absolutely no sound came out. The lavish, heavily filtered story she had been aggressively broadcasting to thousands of followers instantly collapsed into digital dust. The woman she had repeatedly called a freeloader, the woman she had deliberately sprayed with cheap disinfectant, the woman whose dog she had mercilessly tortured, was the undisputed master of the universe she so desperately wanted to inhabit. The absolute truth was undeniable. Diane did not offer a single dramatic pause. She simply pulled a precisely organised, stapled folder from her leather briefcase and handed it directly to the lead police officer, who had quietly stepped into the foyer while Brooke was entirely focused on her hysterical screaming. The officer reviewed the top page, his expression completely unreadable, before passing a duplicate copy directly to Brooke. She snatched the paper with violently trembling fingers. Her eyes darted frantically across the neatly typed lines of text. Diane's voice cut through the stale, alcohol-scented air with absolute chilling clarity. She meticulously detailed the preliminary itemised invoice for the immediate property restoration. There was a specialised deep cleaning fee for the antique hardwood floors, a rigorous chemical treatment for the irreplaceable Persian carpets, and the mandatory replacement of the bespoke velvet upholstery that had been permanently ruined by cigarette burns. The initial conservative estimate for the structural and cosmetic restoration was clearly listed at $120,000. Brooke gasped, physically stumbling backward as if the piece of paper had actively burned her hands. But Diane was far from finished. With another sharp click of her briefcase, she produced a second, significantly thicker document. It bore the heavy, embossed seal of an internationally recognised historical appraiser, Diane explained, in a tone usually reserved for reading mundane quarterly tax reports, that the shattered wooden box on the floor was not a cheap decorative item. It was a verified, historically significant artefact, meticulously inlaid with rare green jade. The certified replacement value was explicitly documented at exactly $85,000. Together, the immediate civil damages exceeded $200,000. Brooke did not have a fraction of that amount to her name. Her entire digital empire was built on heavily discounted fast fashion and carefully angled photographs of other people's property. She instinctively turned to Julian, her eyes wide with absolute suffocating terror, expecting him to magically produce his corporate checkbook to save her. Julian remained completely motionless on the floor, his face buried in his hands, softly weeping into the spilled coffee. He had absolutely nothing left to offer her. The lead police officer stepped forward, signalling his team. They moved with swift, professional detachment. They informed Brooke and her incredibly quiet, terrified friends that they were being formally detained on multiple felony charges, including severe destruction of private property and unauthorized criminal trespassing. Brooke attempted to scream again, asserting her rights as an influencer, but her voice cracked horribly. The officer simply asked her to turn around and place her hands behind her back. The heavy, metallic click of the steel handcuffs echoed loudly against the vaulted ceiling. It was a profoundly cold, unforgiving sound. Brooke was led out of the grand front doors, her expensive designer heels dragging awkwardly across the crushed gravel driveway. Her friends followed in a silent, deeply humiliated line. Julian was escorted out last, completely ignoring me as he walked past. I stood alone in the centre of the ruined living room. I did not smile. I did not feel an overwhelming rush of petty vindication. I simply felt the heavy, necessary satisfaction of order being forcefully restored to my world. The house was finally quiet. 3 days after the arrests, the serene quiet of my downtown penthouse was interrupted by a sharp knock at the door. An exclusive legal courier handed my private security detail a thick manila envelope. I sat at my mahogany desk and sliced the seal open with a silver letter opener. Inside was a formal civil summons, drafted by a notoriously aggressive, low-tier defence attorney whom Brooke had desperately retained. The document was a wildly ambitious attempt to launch a false counterattack. The attorney's primary strategy was absurdly simple, but incredibly dangerous if left unaddressed. Brooke was formally claiming that she was not a criminal trespasser, but rather a legitimate, recognised tenant. The enclosed evidence was a highly pixelated, printed screenshot of a text message exchange supposedly sent from Julian's phone to hers. In the fake message, Julian explicitly stated that he was the rightful owner of the estate and formally granted Brooke a verbal, long-term lease to utilise the property for her digital content creation. The lawyer was attempting to twist a clear felony trespassing charge into a messy, prolonged civil dispute over tenant rights. I did not panic. I did not throw the documents across the room in a blind rage. I simply picked up my secure phone and dialed Diane's direct extension. She arrived at my penthouse exactly 20 minutes later, carrying her laptop and a fresh cup of black coffee. I handed her the printed screenshot. Diane pushed her designer glasses up the bridge of her nose, her eyes scanning the fabricated text message with mild, clinical amusement. We sat together in the quiet morning light and systematically dismantled their desperate, pathetic illusion. First, we pulled the master documents for the irrevocable trust. The legal language I had established years ago was utterly bulletproof. Clause 4 explicitly prohibited any form of subletting, verbal leasing, or temporary residential granting without my direct, in-person biometric authorization. Julian possessed absolutely zero legal capacity to offer the property to anyone, making the supposed text message completely irrelevant in a federal court. But I did not want to merely defeat the claim. I wanted to absolutely annihilate the strategy. I authorized my corporate IT security team to immediately subpoena the digital forensic logs from Julian's confiscated company phone. Within 2 hours, the unarguable truth was delivered to my inbox. The IP address and metadata associated with the fabricated text message confirmed it had been generated through a third-party spoofing application. Furthermore, the digital timestamps explicitly proved the fake message was created on Brooke's own personal device exactly 4 hours after she had been formally released on bail. She had actively manufactured fraudulent evidence to present to a judge. Diane did not bother drafting a lengthy, emotional response. She simply sent a concise, 2-paragraph email directly to Brooke's aggressive defense attorney. She attached the irrevocable trust clause and the definitive IT forensic report. She casually reminded the attorney of the severe, career-ending penalties associated with knowingly submitting forged digital evidence to the district attorney's office. We did not hear back from him. Exactly 40 minutes later, the public court registry showed that the lawyer had officially withdrawn himself as Brooke's legal counsel. Their final card was destroyed. The digital and professional fallout from that single weekend was absolute, swift, and completely merciless. Once the initial police reports became a matter of public record, the meticulously crafted illusion surrounding Brooke's lifestyle rapidly disintegrated. Her followers, possessing the ruthless, investigative efficiency typical of modern internet culture, quickly discovered the formal arrest records and the staggering financial estimates of the property damage. The comment sections on her videos transformed instantly from sycophantic praise into a torrential downpour of mockery and disgust. In a desperate, severely misguided attempt to control the collapsing narrative, Brooke posted a highly produced apology video. She sat on the floor of her modest apartment, wearing zero makeup, forcefully squeezing out tears. She attempted to play the ultimate victim, claiming she was entirely brainwashed by Julian's manipulative lies and had absolutely no idea the estate belonged to his employer. She conveniently omitted the documented fact that she had intentionally smashed an antique jade box and deliberately locked a crippled dog in a freezing shed. The internet did not offer her an ounce of sympathy. My public relations team, working strictly within legal boundaries, ensured that the factual timeline of events remained highly visible. We released a single, extremely dry corporate statement confirming the unauthorized use of company assets and the subsequent termination of the involved employee. The social media platform, overwhelmed by mass reports of fraudulent monetization and aggressive community guideline violations, permanently deleted Brooke's primary account within 48 hours. The architecture of her entirely fake life was completely wiped from the servers. She was left facing massive, inescapable legal debts with absolutely zero source of digital income. Julian's destruction was far less public, but significantly more absolute. I did not grant him the dignity of a face-to-face exit interview. Human Resources dispatched a courier to his listed residence to deliver his formal termination packet. The documents explicitly detailed his gross misconduct, corporate theft, and unauthorized exploitation of highly secure company assets. Because I had chosen to absorb the financial theft privately to protect his grandfather, Julian narrowly avoided a federal embezzlement charge. However, his professional career was permanently eradicated. Diane utilised her extensive network within the city's elite corporate circles. She did not spread malicious gossip. She simply ensured that Julian's verified personnel file, detailing his staggering breach of trust, was quietly flagged in the primary background check databases used by every major architectural and development firm in the Midwest. He was comprehensively blacklisted. No reputable executive would ever hand him a set of corporate keys or a company credit card ever again. He had traded an incredibly lucrative, stable career for a few fleeting moments of borrowed arrogance, and the resulting transaction had left him completely bankrupt. I sat in my office, reviewing the final confirmation of his termination. The corporate machine had efficiently purged the infection from its system. There were no loose ends, no lingering negotiations, and absolutely no room for pathetic excuses. The slate was wiped entirely clean. I closed the personnel file and dropped it seamlessly into the secure shredding bin beside my heavy mahogany desk. The trash was permanently removed. Exactly 1 week after the devastating confrontation at the lake house, my private receptionist buzzed my secure line. Her voice was unusually gentle as she informed me that Walter had arrived in the main lobby. He did not have a scheduled appointment, and he explicitly refused to sit down on the plush waiting room sofas. I closed my laptop, smoothed the lapels of my tailored blazer, and instructed her to bring him directly up to my private corner office. When the heavy oak doors opened, the sight of the old man genuinely struck a quiet chord in my chest. He looked significantly older, leaning so heavily on his carved wooden cane that his knuckles were stark white. The proud, quiet dignity he had carried for decades was completely overshadowed by an incredibly deep, visible blanket of profound shame. He shuffled slowly into the room, refusing to look directly at the expensive artwork or the panoramic view of the Chicago skyline. His eyes remained fixed firmly on the carpet. I did not sit behind my imposing desk. I walked over to the small, intimate seating area near the window and gently guided him into a soft leather chair. I poured him a cup of hot, herbal tea, setting it carefully on the glass table between us. We sat in absolute silence for several long minutes. The distant, muffled sounds of the bustling city below felt entirely irrelevant. Finally, Walter swallowed hard, his voice barely rising above a coarse whisper. He told me he knew everything. He had seen the termination papers. He had seen the staggering itemized bills for the property damage. He did not attempt to manufacture a single excuse for Julian's catastrophic behavior. He simply looked at his trembling hands and apologised, stating that his grandson's actions were an unforgivable disgrace to their family name. He told me he completely understood if I decided to immediately cease funding his specialised cardiovascular treatments. He fully expected to be collateral damage in Julian's arrogant war. I took a slow, measured sip of my own tea. I looked at the weathered lines on Walter's face, tracing the history of a man who had once given up his entire life savings to keep a starving, grieving teenager off the harsh winter streets. I placed my cup down softly. My voice was calm, completely devoid of anger or corporate calculation. I looked directly into his tear-filled eyes. "Walter," I said quietly, ensuring every word carried absolute weight. "I have already contacted the hospital billing department this morning. I authorised a direct irrevocable wire transfer that fully covers your comprehensive medical care for the next 3 consecutive years. Julian will not have access to a single penny of those funds. My profound debt is to you, and to you alone. I will never punish you for the miserable, arrogant choices your grandson freely made." Walter covered his face with his calloused hands, his narrow shoulders shaking with quiet, overwhelming sobs of relief. I let him cry. I had successfully severed the toxic branch while firmly protecting the healthy root. The boundary was finally drawn. The debt was purely honoured. 6 months passed with incredible healing speed. The brutal Chicago winter eventually melted away, surrendering to the bright, vibrant warmth of an early summer. I took a rare, uninterrupted Friday afternoon off and drove my custom sedan out to the private, forested road leading to the Lake Michigan estate. The heavy wrought iron gates swung open silently, welcoming me into a sanctuary that had been completely purged of its toxic memories. The historic stone villa looked magnificent bathed in the golden afternoon sunlight. The interior had been meticulously, flawlessly restored. The antique hardwood floors gleamed with fresh oil, entirely free of sticky alcohol residue or muddy footprints. The expensive velvet sofas had been entirely replaced, and the air smelled exclusively of fresh pine and expensive lemon polish. But the most significant change was prominently displayed directly above the grand stone fireplace. I had collected every single shattered fragment of my mother's jade sketching box. I did not attempt to glue the broken pieces back into their original, functional shape. Instead, I commissioned a master artisan to carefully suspend the jagged green stones inside a thick, perfectly clear block of museum-grade resin. The solid block was then encased in a heavy, minimalist silver frame and mounted on the wall. It was no longer a hidden box meant to hold pencils. It was a visible, striking piece of modern art. It stood as a constant, beautiful reminder that true legacy cannot be permanently destroyed, only transformed into something stronger. A happy, rhythmic thumping sound broke my quiet contemplation. Barnaby came rushing into the living room. He was navigating the restored carpets in a brand new, custom-engineered titanium wheelchair. The advanced mobility cart was significantly lighter and infinitely more comfortable than his old one. His golden tail wagged furiously, his eyes bright and completely free of the terrifying shadows I had seen in that freezing gardening shed. I knelt down on the pristine rug, laughing softly as he happily licked my cheek. I walked over to my desk near the window and opened a fresh, leather-bound portfolio. Inside was the finalised legal charter for a newly established philanthropic organisation. I had taken the entire financial settlement extracted from the aggressive liquidation of Brooke's few remaining assets and redirected it entirely. I signed my name at the bottom of the charter, officially launching the Barnaby Senior Rescue Fund. The endowment would provide immediate critical funding for specialised mobility equipment and advanced veterinary care for disabled, abandoned dogs across the entire state. I looked out the window, watching the calm, blue waters of the massive lake gently lapping against the private shoreline. The chaotic noise of arrogant trespassers and false influencers had been completely silenced, replaced by the steady, enduring rhythm of actual, substantial creation. I had not merely defended my territory, I had actively used the debris of their pathetic attack to build a fortress of positive impact. The air in the room felt incredibly light, entirely free of historical burdens and borrowed delusions. The sanctuary was finally perfect. I stood by the expansive, floor-to-ceiling windows of my downtown penthouse, watching the vibrant city lights of Chicago slowly flicker to life against the darkening evening sky. The towering architectural structures below me stood as silent, enduring testaments to precision, hard work, and unwavering structural integrity. From this quiet altitude, the frantic, desperate noise of people desperately pretending to be something they were not was entirely imperceptible. People like Brooke and Julian spend their entire lives endlessly chasing the incredibly fragile illusion of power. They believe that wearing an expensive designer coat, sitting in a custom luxury vehicle, or aggressively demanding respect in a crowded lobby automatically elevates their fundamental worth. They operate under the tragic delusion that status can be casually borrowed, stolen, or forcefully, aggressively mimicked. They fundamentally fail to understand the cold, undeniable reality of the world. True power never requires a loud, dramatic performance. It does not need to scream its authority at a confused receptionist or desperately seek validation from anonymous digital followers on a glowing screen. Real power is inherently quiet. It is the steady, unyielding confidence of knowing exactly what you possess and precisely what it costs to build it. It is the ability to look at a shattered piece of jade and calmly construct a legal machine that systematically grinds the offender into absolute dust without ever raising your voice above a polite conversational whisper. I reached up and gently touched the smooth, silver clasp of a new necklace resting against my collarbone. It was a simple, understated piece, holding a single, tiny fragment of green jade that the artisan had saved from the resin block. It carried the undeniable weight of my mother's grueling sacrifice and the enduring strength of the boundaries I had ruthlessly enforced. I had completely honoured my past without allowing it to dangerously sabotage my present. Julian had chosen to borrow his employer's life until it violently suffocated him. Brooke had chosen to play a temporary, arrogant queen inside a fortress that actively despised her. Their manufactured reality had collapsed exactly as all cheap, foundationless structures eventually do when subjected to real applied pressure. They had mistaken my profound stillness for vulnerability, utterly unaware that the most dangerous storms do not announce their arrival with loud theatrical thunder. They simply arrive, executing their absolute devastation with cold, mathematical precision, leaving nothing but clear skies in their wake. I turned away from the breathtaking skyline, walking back toward the quiet warmth of my private sanctuary. I reached out and pulled the heavy velvet curtains closed, shutting out the chaotic noise of the world below. The legacy remained entirely mine. If you believe that patience and the law are the most formidable punishments for liars, please share this story to support the truth.